Can I welcome all registrants who are attending, and I would congratulate you on your understanding of the significance of this webinar to not only us, but to all Australians and indeed humanity. I should also commence by saying that as chair, I am chair from the Ghana land in South Australia. I would like to congratulate the last panel on their session, and particularly as to what Musa said about Hamas and its categorisation as a terrorist organisation. It is clearly not, but we'll probably deal with that during our session. Can I just start by introducing the panel? Greg Barnes is a barrister and a senior counsel. He's a former national president of the Australian Lawyers Association and is a prominent writer for Pearls and Irritations. Mary Kostakidis is well known as a former newsreader for SBS World News, in other words, a prominent Australian journalist, and now certainly a recognised human rights advocate. Antoun Issa worked as a journalist in Beirut for some 3 years. He was news editor for Al Monitor, establishing a team of Palestinian journalists in Gaza. After Beirut, he located to Washington, D.C., where he worked for the Middle East Institute. In 2020, he returned to Australia, smart man, and joined Guardian Australia until he resigned in 2024 over the Guardian's coverage of the genocide. So the intended format of this session, because as you'll have seen from the title, it's legal and media dilemmas, that I felt that it's best to divide it into almost two, legal and media, and have Greg address the legal and Mary and Antoun the media, but we're not going to be too formal about these things. Mary and Antoun are more than welcome to contribute to the discussion on legal issues, and similarly Greg in respect of journalist issues. Can I invite you to address these issues? Firstly, has the Western press, including the Australian press, fully presented the issues of genocide to the Australian public? What part has anti-Semitism played in the Australian public response to Gaza? And have leaders in Australian public affairs, politicians, journalists, educators, been victimised for speaking up for Palestinians? So, Mary, I'll let you launch into it.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Well, there's an awful lot to say. I'll try and motor through. I'd like to begin, though, by just making a couple of comments about the characterisation and listing of terrorists. Obviously, Nelson Mandela comes to mind. So he was categorised as a terrorist. He was jailed for over 2 decades, and then he became a president. One of the things I heard when I first joined a newsroom, and I was very pleased to hear this said, is one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Now, those who come from cultures where the lives of ordinary people are at the mercy of colonial powers understand this at a very fundamental level. The listing of terrorists is a political decision, and Australia follows US policy generally. And we only have to look at what's happened to Jolani to understand how political these decisions are. One of the fundamental questions we could have asked over the last couple of years is, why do so many millions of Arabs and other Muslims revere Nasrallah? Why do they regard Yahya Sinwar as a hero? Because unless we comprehend this, we've no hope of understanding the problem, let alone any hope of achieving a just and lasting peace. We can and must continue to be able to critique and comment on government policy and decisions, including the listing of terrorists. If that stops, then we are no longer a democracy. Paul Gregoire reported a couple of days ago that the Australian Federal Police Commissioner responded to a question on notice from Mark Latham, saying that none of the 14 anti-Semitic incidents involved anyone in Iran. Now, why isn't this front page news? Investigative journalist Matt Kennard in the UK revealed 2 days ago that the spy aircraft he's been tracking, sent by the UK from Cyprus to fly, in circles over Gaza, has been transmitting information it gathers in real time to the Israeli military, making the UK not complicit in genocide, but a participant in the genocide in Gaza. Now, why isn't that front page news? Now, where is the mainstream media in all this? Israel's assault on the Palestinian people was characterised by Holocaust survivor and trauma expert Dr. Gabor Mate as Auschwitz on TikTok. Now, that phrase encapsulated both what's been unleashed on the Palestinians and the significance of social media, where Palestinians have been able to live stream their own genocide. Greater numbers of the public are turning to social media to watch events unfold because they know they can't rely on the mainstream media. Not to say that there aren't pockets of good journalism, and some organisations, of course, are doing better than others. So bias in the media has manifested itself in many different ways over the past couple of years. The very different way that victims are treated. Israeli victims are people with names, families, aspirations, personal stories. Palestinians are statistics in the large numbers of those killed and injured daily. The emphasis by far has been on Israeli hostages, regardless of the fact that the vast majority of the 11,000 Palestinian men, women and children held without charge in Israeli jails, many of whom are tortured, raped, killed or die in custody, are considered hostages by the Palestinian people. There's no description of the obscene atrocities inflicted on children. Now, mainstream media don't like to show explicit material, and we won't go into why, because that's another subject again. But there isn't even a description of the types of atrocities that we are seeing. But there has been so much repetition of the lives of 40 beheaded Israeli babies, as well as other unsubstantiated claims, such as widespread rape. Now, had the bodies of 130 or so Palestinian prisoners so badly tortured they could not be identified, had they been Israeli, it would have made front page news everywhere, reflecting the very different value placed on those lives by the media. Similarly, the extraordinary number of Palestinian children killed, the number of health workers, rescue teams, journalists, Palestinian journalists in Gaza who have continued to work knowing they will be killed and are, one after the other or 5 at a time, with claims that they're linked to Hamas repeated in headlines when we know that many people will only read the headlines. So the effect is plausible deniability is created when in fact they are being targeted because they are journalists. We see repeated claims that Israel does not target children when doctors and x-rays and videos and images tell a different story. There was no coverage that I remember seeing at all of the first ICJ advisory, and therefore there was a failure to inform the public of Australia's obligations under the Genocide Convention and a failure then to hold our leaders to account. A failure also to call them out on double standards. The West was very quick to slap sanctions on Russia and other countries that are not considered friends. Dennis Richardson was not challenged over his statement, "From the river to the sea is a violent slogan," when it is entrenched in Israeli law. So Israel can say, "From the river to the sea, sovereignty only for the Jewish people," but the Palestinian people can't say, they're just not permitted to say that. So I want to look at the past and what has led to this, what has led to the world doing nothing while a people are being genocided. Over decades, the mainstream media has assisted in dehumanising Palestinians and legitimising Israel's actions in our coverage of the conflict. And I say ours because I was part of the mainstream media. We failed to name it. It's Zionist settler colonialism can only achieve its aims through demographic engineering, where the choice for Palestinians is to leave or die. That's the choice, leave or die. We rarely platformed Palestinian voices. We would go to Israeli spokesmen daily for what were called updates. Journalists went back and forth to Israel on junkets, and while there they spoke to Palestinians, only Palestinians who were authorised to speak to them by Israel. The lobby here wined and dined select journalists. The lobby had access to media board members and managing directors. They're a powerful group that understood that control of the narrative was critical to ensure support for Israel's objectives and impunity for its actions. But it was not just influence and pressure that resulted in a long history of giving more time to the Israeli perspective. It also occurred voluntarily and with no self-awareness of the global North bias and how that fails to meet our own standards of impartiality, objectivity, neutrality, and balance, that holy grail of journalism. So the conflict has historically been seen as a remote problem for us, created by Arabs unfriendly towards Israel. Australians holiday in Israel, their children serve in the IDF. Few have travelled to Gaza and the West Bank, other than those who work in the area of human rights. So there's been little understanding of the conditions imposed on Palestinians who live in Gaza and the West Bank. Somehow the impression is created they live the way they do because they're Arab. Now, if we consider other factors that have shaped our perspective, the key shared cultural experiences, our collective memory and response to the Holocaust, first and foremost, looms large. Other shared cultural experiences, well, the Diary of Anne Frank, that we've all read, Schindler's List that we've all read and watched, Exodus by Leon Uris, the depiction of Israel as this idyllic society established by settlers forging a new nation with occasional unfortunate skirmishes with hostile Arabs. Journalists who developed first-hand knowledge of what was going on in the Middle East and in Palestine in particular, who knew the historical context, who understood the injustice and the level of violence and dispossession and the system of apartheid aimed at strangling Palestinian life, while negotiations are constantly undermined and scuttled, those journalists have had to leave the mainstream media. The difference today is the impact of social media and independent journalism, and that have allowed the public to see for themselves what's going on and hear analysis and important perspectives from experts who have also been banished from mainstream media. There's a generation of journalists today that are more informed because of the diversity of their backgrounds and because of the many alternative sources of information and analysis available in the digital world today. But today, suppression is much more overt and widespread, in particular because of the growing menace of the public about what is taking place and because of the need to recapture control of the narrative. SBS was reported recently to have given a directive to staff not to use the word Palestine because it's contested. An extraordinary directive, given most of the world, including Australia, has recognised Palestine. It's a lot worse today also because the consequences are more egregious because of the scale of the slaughter of civilians, including children, but also because of the polarisation in the community here between those openly supporting the genocide and those becoming increasingly frustrated and angry at the inaction of the global community and the extraordinary attempts to silence speech. Now, what changes are necessary for the media to fulfil its role? Well, some self-reflection for a start. And it's a great pity that Chris Hedges' National Press Club address was cancelled, because there would have been no better place to start this public discussion. Because if we fail to interrogate our own biases, we're deluded in believing that we're objective in our craft. And you can't be charged with holding power to account, but not broker self-scrutiny. The media has to make room again for journalists like Chris Hedges, like Fisk, like Lattouf, like Antoun Issa, whom we're going to hear from in a moment. It has to have a long and hard think about its holy grail: impartiality, objectivity, neutrality, balance, which creates plausible deniability and compounds the injustice for victims. In my view, objectivity is integral in examining a situation, as is context and a knowledge of history. It does not compel you as a journalist to remain neutral or to be constantly trying to balance what you have concluded is truth with giving equal weight to lies. We have to ask, how would I be framing this story if the shoe were on the other foot? If these children were Israeli, or if these bombs were Iranian? Cultural change is made, of course, at the top, at the level of board appointments and managing director appointments, and that is dependent on political appetite. And I think in the meantime, it is for journalists to act through their union, and they should not let high-profile people off the hook. It's about the obligation to report and comment in a way that informs the public, not masks the truth. And just a final comment about the lawfare waged against me and others. This is because we are compelled to show that there is another side to this story, to give voice to those who have been denied a voice for so long. And this is the major transgression. This is the transgression, because Israel must always be treated with reverence, no matter how egregious and criminal its actions. In other words, in a way that's exceptional. So the answer is, we must stop holding Israel to a different standard. And I'll stop there, because I'd like to hear what Antoun has to say.
Yeah, and Antoun, I know that you've got a lot to say about this, particularly about having to terminate your employment. But I'd quite like to get back to the original format, Greg being here, and after Greg's, then I'll invite Antoun and Mary, you to come back to the media issue. Is that all right, Antoun? You happy with that? Okay. Well, now, Greg, you've got a fairly large topic, legal issues associated with the genocide. Away you go.
I'll keep it relatively brief because we've got one more speaker after me, and then I assume we've got some questions and discussion. The legal issues are numerous, but I'm just going to focus on two. The first one is Australian citizens who fight for the IDF. I think there are over 1,000 Australians who've fought for the IDF. There are also a number of Australians who have gone and participated in volunteer movements that have some association with this war. Now, under the Commonwealth Criminal Code, the Rome Statute, which is administered by the International Criminal Court, includes crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and other war crimes. You can be guilty under Australian law of participating in those actions, irrespective of the fact that you're overseas. So it's what's called extraterritorial reach. So to give a simple example, if I join a mercenary outfit and I go and participate in the slaughter of a group of people in the Congo, to take an example of an unsettled country, I could be charged under Australian law. Now, excuse me, in South Africa, the South African government has taken the attitude that anyone who has participated with the IDF, either on the front line, or alternatively in some other capacity with the IDF in this particular conflict are going to be interviewed on return. Australia has a track record of interviewing those who, for example, fought for ISIS or went to the Middle East during the War on Terror. When they came back to Australia, they were interviewed. So-called Jihad Jack Thomas was one of those, the most famous of those cases. As I understand it, there are no interviews that have been done. And in fact, the government has merely said, oh, we will remind people to understand their obligations under Australian law and international law. This is in contrast to the very, very hard rhetoric used by previous governments in relation to ISIS and other groups. And I hold no brief for ISIS, and the Australian government was right to warn people about their actions, but it ought to be doing so consistently. So that's the first issue. And it's allied to a sort of aiding and abetting argument in relation to defence contractors. David Shoebridge, the Green Senator, has done a lot of very good work on this, despite the government denials that it's not assisting or aiding and abetting in this conflict through arms exports, indirect or direct, including, for example, software. It is. And there, again, ought to be, if there's credible evidence, investigations by the Australian Federal Police. I'll make it clear that I'm not suggesting any of the Australians who has fought in the IDF or been participating in this conflict has committed those crimes. So make that very clear. All I'm saying is, if there is evidence, there are options within Australia for charges to be brought. The second issue really relates to Australia itself and its obligations to arrest those who are subject to ICC warrants. So countries such as Canada, Ireland, Spain, I think have all said that if Netanyahu came to their country, they would arrest him because that's their obligation under the Rome Statute. The Australian government, as I understand it, has said we will comply with international law, which is a very soft statement and does not commit them to an arrest of Netanyahu in Australia, or anyone else, by the way, who's under an ICC warrant. You can contrast that rhetoric, soft rhetoric, if you like, with the attitude taken by the Australian government to those subject to ICC warrants from other nations, particularly in relation to African nations where the ICC has tended to focus its efforts and been criticised for doing so on the basis that it's sort of low-hanging fruit. But that's an important issue for Australia to recognise. And perhaps allied to that is also this refusal by the Prime Minister to call Israel an apartheid state. And he has this bizarre logic in quotes, that says, oh, that was unique to South Africa. That's just simply nonsense. As a matter of law, that is nonsense. Apartheid is a crime against humanity. And simply because it has an Afrikaner name does not mean it hasn't been translated into other countries in the world. And we know that it has, including in Israel. And so, again, it's a failure to consistently uphold our international law obligations that should be of major concern to Australians. Now, the Albanese government has a chance here to ensure that if there is any credible evidence in relation to any individuals who have participated in this conflict, it must act. Now, I'm going to say that should apply to both sides because, the thing about the rule of law is it's meant not to favour one side over another. And it's a nice theory. But in practice, of course, it has to be so. My argument is that what Australia would do is if somebody came back and they'd been, for example, supporting Hamas, they would be arrested and they would be charged with a variety of terrorism offences. If someone comes back to Australia having participated in some of the most brutal actions of the many brutal actions of the IDF, less likely that they would be at least interviewed and even less likely that they would be charged. And so they're sort of three important legal issues which are missing in the narrative. And what has also been missing in the narrative is the strength of the Attorney General. It's the Attorney General that has to, in some of these cases, allow for the prosecution. It's not just the DPP's decision. Previous Attorney General Mark Dreyfus was frankly hopeless on this issue, and Michelle Rowland not much better. There should be strong statements made by the Attorney General, the first law officer in this country, to say people ought to be very aware that the Australian government will not tolerate Australian citizens committing or aiding and abetting or committing directly crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, etc. Now, as again, I'm not saying anyone has, but what I'm saying is that that ought to be a warning going out. I mean, this is a genocide. I certainly am aware, I think, of the Australian government warning people in relation to Russia and Ukraine, rightly so, but you have to apply it consistently. And at best, the response of the Australian government has been sotto voce. So I might leave it there, Paul, and so that we can go to questions after Antoun.
Yeah, but I might just ask you a question whilst you've just finished that topic, because it is a legal question and it's related to the International Court of Justice and the ICC for that matter, I suppose. But people will recall that in July 2024, the International Court of Justice handed down a ruling which declared that advisory opinion which declared that the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem was illegal. Settlements in those areas were illegal, that Israel had to end the settlements, etc. And so a significant advisory opinion. And one of the responses from Israel is to say, and I quote, "We can dismiss any decision of the ICJ because it is biased," end quote. Now, as a lawyer, have you ever heard any such suggestion?
I mean, this is what regimes do. This is what venal regimes do. Constantly cast out on the umpire and dismiss the umpire. If you look at the makeup of the ICJ, which includes a very prominent Australian jurist, Hilary Charlesworth, it is from across the globe. That's the point. The other point I'd make about that provisional opinion is that in stark contrast to Australia's actions in relation to Japanese whaling activities in the Southern Ocean, where Australia took Japan to the ICJ, got a ruling, and then was swanning around the world saying Japan has to get its act together, Japan has to stop whaling in the Southern Ocean. The response of the Australian government to the ICJ provisional opinion was, again, to pick up Mary's point, seemed to have been crafted or at least heavily influenced by the incessant lobbying of the Israel lobby in this country, of those who are pro-Netanyahu and pro the current actions. The ICJ, you either sign up to the ICJ and respect its advisory opinions or you don't. You can't pick and choose.
All right, well, now let's come back to Mary and Antoun. Perhaps, Antoun, you might like to head off with any commentary that you have on Mary's comments.
Actually, I wanted to start with a question to Greg, actually. Sorry to drag you back into this, because I just wanted to, so what you're referring to with the conversation around apartheid and Albo's response to that is exactly the conversation we had inside The Guardian. I put that question to Jamie Wilson, who is the international editor in the UK, on a huge staff call when we're talking about the Gaza attacks in 2021. And I asked him why we're not using the word apartheid in our coverage when, at that time, all the major human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, had concluded through investigations, and I think that's also important words to use. They didn't accuse, they did huge investigations, and the conclusions of their studies showed that Israeli measures in the West Bank amounted to apartheid. His response was the exact same argument that Albo used, which suggests to everyone why The Guardian and every other media organization still doesn't use the word apartheid. Because in South Africa, his argument was the regime at the time referred to themselves as the apartheid regime. So it's a distinctive, so it operates only in a distinctive South African context. So I think for the benefit of myself and everyone who has these arguments, especially in newsrooms, what is the legal definition and term? How is it applied legalistically today, apartheid? Has it evolved beyond that in a legal setting, beyond merely being utilized in a South African context to something more global? Does it have a global definition that can be used in other contexts?
Well, as you rightly say, Antoun, we saw that in 2021. There have been a number of findings. There was a letter published last year, or a document published by a number of law scholars in the United States, which clearly set out the basis for apartheid. And apartheid, emerged from South Africa, but is not confined to it. And it simply means, without getting too technical, that you treat one group of people more favourably than another group of people, and you do so through your legal architecture. And that's exactly what apartheid is. It's not de facto in that sense, but de facto can become in effect institutional. There's no doubt that Israel is an apartheid society. I remember talking to former ABC journalist's partner. They lived there for many, many years ago. And this woman said to me, in our street, we saw apartheid. The Arabs weren't given the same, for example, and this is a trivial example, but for example, garbage disposal night. They just do the Israeli houses and just leave. I mean, that's South Africa. What Albanese does deliberately, and this is because this is his general demeanour, which is to be weak. He runs this idea that apartheid is an Afrikaans word, it has a specific meaning, and it's gone. Well, let me tell you, in South Africa, the South African government and the South African legal scholarship would tell you, and does tell you, that what's happening in Israel is exactly what's happened in South Africa. The fact that it's called apartheid is merely historic. But to say it's confined is absurd, because that would mean that any other country that replicated exactly what South Africa had done wouldn't be called apartheid. I mean, honestly. So that's the answer to that, Antoun. It's clearly apartheid.
Yeah, right. And I think those technicalities are exactly what media bosses and editors try to use and draw upon in order to, circumvent and skirt around telling the full picture, right?
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of, and I saw a question before in the audience about whether media organizations are told not to use the word genocide. So apartheid is one. Yeah. So I can tell you from the Guardian context, I left the Guardian mid last year, around June 2024, after a long battle inside to push for better coverage of Israel and Palestine. We had an open letter that went out in late 2023 that 300 plus Australian journalists signed across newsrooms. I drafted that with a bunch of other journalists from other newsrooms. And that was a copy and paste of another open letter that circulated in the US that was also written by Guardian journalists in the US. And so in response to that, the Guardian leadership really went into a bit of a frenzy, I would say, and sent out a really haphazard, poorly written email to every single Guardian staff member across the world, banning all of us from signing open letters. Technically, it said we need to seek approval from our senior managers before signing open letters, and that resulted in a furor that I was a part of. We got the unions on board across all three offices, which is the US, UK, and Australia, to pretty much tell the management, we're not accepting this, have a go and try and discipline us, and we'll sue you. So, and it's been stuck in limbo ever since. The management haven't said anything about it. So that was an interesting case of staff kind of pushing back against management and kind of keeping it all frozen. But that hasn't changed how the Guardian has been covering and didn't cover the genocide as it unfolded until I left. So often what happened was, it's first and foremost, there are certain policies that were handed down from the get-go. We had to refer to, so there was no use of the word genocide, no use of the word apartheid, unless it's quoted or attributed. And we always had to refer to the Gaza Health Ministry as the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. And so just were a few instances like that kind of from the get-go kind of coloured our coverage. Newsletter in the afternoon, and the kind of I had several moments where everything just kind of blew up with my editors. The first moment was when the Israelis first attacked a Shifa hospital. It was in November 2023, and I knew that I was going to have an argument because I've been having arguments every day with the editors, and so I just, you start to self-censor, right? And so I just wrote something that was completely benign, hoping to just not have an argument that day. And I just wrote, Israeli forces are outside the hospital, Hamas are inside, whatever. They're about to have a clash. And I had three editors, three British editors who work in Guardian Australia, male British editors, pretty much write in the Israeli claim that there was a Hamas command center beneath that hospital. And I just flatly said, I'm not writing that. I'm not going to write something that you can't verify. You need to verify that. That is our job as a journalist. If we haven't verified that, we can't just put government spin, especially surrounding a huge war crime in bombing a hospital. I was overridden. We had several tense phone calls. And that was put in. And that was really the catalyst for why I wanted to do that open letter across the industry, because those experiences were being had everywhere in Australian newsrooms. The ABC, forget about News Corp, obviously, SMH, the Saturday paper, obviously, which is run by Zionists. Well, they're all run by Zionists. It was a battle in every newsroom that everyone was having, especially those of color, especially those of Arab background or Muslim faith. In addition to that, people who, or after that, I would say, after the open letter was signed, I would say that the media industry went through a kind of quiet purge of the journalists who signed that. That definitely was the case at SMH. If you're an avid reader of the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age, you might notice that some faces names who were there 2 years ago are no longer there, or they've been corralled. And the coverage of the SMH has become, blatantly more pro-Israel, pro-Zion. It's almost like a Zionist, like an outlet for the pro-Israel lobby. Whatever they want, they just churn it out in the Sydney Morning Herald. Because there's no one left there to push back. There's no one left there to have any arguments. They've kind of quietly purged them all. The Guardian's been a similar case. You would have seen that they've lost a lot of talent in the last 2 years for various reasons, but the genocide has really caused a sense of discontent, I think, within a low morale. That's kind of pushed people to the edges and to leave, especially people of color. There are fewer people of color working at the Guardian Australia than there were when I was there. And of course, we know everything that's happened with your ABC. But the ABC's response to the Latouf case is emblematic of how media bosses are operating in this country. So after Latouf won that case, the ABC didn't have a mea culpa moment. They didn't be like, oh, let's change. And I'll add to that the Latouf case also came after an independent report that the ABC themselves commissioned in 2024, which found that there was systemic racism in the ABC. So this is an organization that is, at this moment, systemically racist. We know that. It's in its structures. It's pervasive in the ABC. They then lose a lawsuit against Latouf. Still no mea culpa moment. They have doubled down. They've come up with a social media policy that's even worse and more stringent and more restrictive on their journalists than before Latouf. They have just doubled down. And that is emblematic of how all the media bosses in this country are operating. They are doubling down. They're not changing. They're not giving an inch. And as a result of that, I'm just explaining the context here, but as a result of that, you've seen in the last 6 months, a bit of an explosion of independent media outlets. I've started one with Alex McKinnon. It's called Deep Cut News. Antoun and Jan Fran have started one called Et Media. There's Lamestream with Scott Mitchell and Oz Faruqi. And all of us come from the mainstream media. We're all mainstream media journalists, and we've left, and it's just kind of a fracturing of the media landscape is what's happening right now. And because one of the consequences of these media bosses persisting with the way they're persisting, not changing, not evolving, not compromising, is that audiences start to see all of this, right? And I don't know if they have this assumption that, mainstream media is the centerpiece of public discourse, and audiences will always come to them as kind of like the arbiters of public discourse, or the kind of the place in which public discourse is held in this country. And I don't think they've quite caught on to the fact that that's no longer the case. Audiences are leaving and looking for information from different sources, and that's resulting in some problems, obviously, with social media. Social media algorithms, really amplify outrage and all the nasty things that kind of float about on social media. But it also creates opportunities for communities to be established where you can find sources of trustworthy, reliable journalism. And that's where I think this independent landscape has now started to find some space and find some traction. And I don't think they've caught on to that just yet in the media landscape. And before I left The Guardian, I worked a lot in audiences. So I was very familiar. I know exactly what The Guardian's audience trends were. And I can divulge for all of you here that between 2016 and 2024, when I left The Guardian UK, did a huge audience study. And they found that between the numbers in 2024 were pretty much the same as their numbers in 2016. And that's really important because in that time frame, you had two really huge growth spurts for mainstream media in the West. You had the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, which saw a huge spike in digital subscriptions for places like the New York Times, Washington Post, Democracy Dies in Darkness, all that. And then you had COVID, which saw a huge spike again in traffic for mainstream media outlets. What that data in 2024 suggests from The Guardian was that they were unable to retain any of the new audiences that may have come to them between 2016 and 2024. And within that, there's only a tiny fraction of their audience numbers that they would classify as those who come to them on a regular basis. In other words, and this is The Guardian, right? This is probably the least of the bad, the least of the crop, the least worst media organization of the crop. But media organizations are already losing in like long-term trends. They are already losing audiences. They were already losing trust even before the genocide started. And all the genocide has done is that it has accelerated a trend that was already in motion, right? So it's accelerated a kind of like repulsion, a repelling of audiences, because everyone can see the disconnect between looking at your phone and seeing children crushed under rubble or slaughtered or shot by bullets and soldiers laughing and dancing as they're doing it, versus the headlines that are coming out, or even sometimes at the moment they're barely even covering it. So and people can't unsee what they've already seen. People can't unsee the atrocities that we've all seen. And for some reason, this doesn't seem to be sinking into media, the editors that run these newsrooms. But I also want to frame this and I talk about context. I'm a big context person, and I want to frame where we are at in terms of an Australian context, right? Australia's media outlets, with the exception of The Guardian, because it came from the UK, Australia's media outlets were all kind of found their feet and found their rhythm during the era of the White Australia policy, right? So these are outlets that have always had a proximity, I think, to elitism and Anglo-Celtic elitism in this country. And their coverage has always been reflective of that. That's why you don't see much diversity in any of the news networks or any of the newsrooms. And I think Palestine has been a moment where we've started to see newer communities that have arrived to Australia start to push for, I guess, a seat at the table of national discourse with their own authentic perspectives, Am I going too far? Am I at
Thanks,
11:30?
Latif. Yeah, I might just have to interrupt
Oh, sorry. Okay.
because we are running out of time. But one question that's come in from a viewer is related, and it's this: is there an organisation charged with regulatory oversight of the media and to pull up bias? Could a regulatory change make a difference? Do you know anything about that, Mary? Have you got any answer to any?
As someone who has complained in the past, I don't think there's much joy there from the regulator. It always goes back to all these are editorial decisions. That's a tough one. It's about the culture of an organisation, and these cultures are very hard to shift. I agree with everything Antoun said. The only joy in it for me is that their readership and viewership numbers are diminishing because we are turning to outfits like Deep Cut News, like Declassified Australia, like Pearls and Irritations. We're watching internationally Mehdi Hassan, Tucker Carlson, Piers Morgan, and a whole host of other experts like Glenn Deason, the Duran, Consortium News. There's the choice out there is phenomenal. It's impossible to get through the amount of material daily. It really is a feast. And yet there's this little pocket, this, beast called mainstream media who still think that they are central to this narrative. Unfortunately, they are very connected to the narrative of our political leaders. And it's about how we make our voices heard in independent media. And I think that that's happening with the public. It's the public that is saying, we've had enough of this, it's rubbish. We want to hear the truth from politicians, and we want to hear the truth we want to read and see and hear the truth in the media.
Item 8 of the Trump peace plan reads, and I quote, entry and distribution of aid in the Gaza Strip will proceed without interference from the two parties through the United Nations and its agencies. On 22nd of October, the International Court of Justice handed down a judgment which held that Israel is legally obligated to permit the unlimited and unhindered entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, specifically including aid deliveries by UNRWA. And listeners will note UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Work Agencies. Clearly, UNRWA is a UN agency. The response of the United States Department of State, however, was, quote, another corrupt ruling by the ICJ, end quote, and Secretary Rubio today doubled down, calling UNRWA, quote, a subsidiary of Hamas, which is not going to play any role in delivering aid to Gaza. Now, the question is, if we have the United States participating in the preparation of a peace plan and making decisions like that, well, where are we going?
Just a quick answer on that. I mean, the United States is a rogue state. It's contempt for international law.
Recording in progress.
Hang on. Yeah, you keep going, guys.
Okay. Well, I was going to probably say the similar thing to what you want to say anyway. So, US, this is a dilemma for Australia, right? And this is where the kind of the incompetence of the Australian political class is really evident here. Australia's national interests have been based on maintaining this semblance of international law and this rules-based international system that Penny Wong keeps talking about, right? Except the main powers that are ravaging this system happens to be Australia's principal ally and the country that it's most dependent on, the United States, with its colonial attachment in Israel. So this is a profound dilemma for Australia on a global. I'm just speaking in a global context. Maybe Greg can speak to more about it in the international legal framework. I'm speaking more from a foreign policy perspective and considering Australia's national interest. Australia, like all nations of the world, depend on this notion of having international law and a rules-based international system in order to keep the global stability that allows for trade, that allows for the things that every nation needs to survive. And that's even more important for nations like Australia that are middle powers, that are smaller powers, that don't have the clout and the weight of a country like a power like the United States or a China to really set its own terms in the global system. So we are, even if I just isolate Australia in terms of our national interests, we are in a moment where we need to make some really calculated decisions as to where we want to sit. Because if we go along with the United States and the Trump administration as it is, a rogue state at the moment, operating as a rogue state in the system, ravaging the international system that it put together, right? Or are we going to delineate and actually articulate what our national interests are in the international system, independent of the US, and start making policies towards that national interest? This is the moment that Australia finds itself in. And it's a moment that no one here is really talking about. And it's going to leave this country completely unprepared for the consequences of the unraveling of international law and the consequences that it's going to have for smaller powers like Australia. We just interviewed Chris Sidoti, the UN investigator that was part of the team that found that Israel was conducting genocide in Gaza. And he said, and he addressed this point, I think, in a really kind of pointed way, which is that international law is all that stands between us and this world and abyss and anarchy. And the Singaporean Prime Minister said similar things last week or the week before in an interview, where as Singapore, as a small, tiny city-state, is looking around and being like, the international order is falling apart. International law is becoming meaningless. And that's leaving them in a vulnerable state. So countries around the world are starting to feel this sense of vulnerability from the US and Israel, completely pulling apart international law. And sadly for Australia, because our political and our media class, are so inept, I can't think of another word right now, are so inept and don't have the intellectual depth and capacity to deal with this, or even notice that this is a challenge that we need to address, I think we're going to be left behind. And I think that's a really, it's not a good place to be. But Greg, do you have anything to add that?
Well, hopefully you can hear me now without echo. Yeah. I'm going to very briefly, because I know we're going to wrap this up, very briefly say I don't disagree with any of that. Having said all that, one of the problems of international law is it's not enforceable. So it does rely on the culture and the commitment of nations to ensure that there is compliance. And my point about Japan earlier was that there's selective compliance. Australia, when it suits it, will comply. Australia, of course, had previously had a very strong track record in the ICJ, where Lionel Murphy argued the French nuclear test case back in 1974. It's had a very, very good reputation. But its reputation now, I think, has been diminished. But that's been since the Howard years and, the unlawful war in Iraq, etc. So I think Australia's reputation globally is simply one that it's of being a Washington lackey and therefore lacking the fortitude and the influence when it comes to ensuring that international law means something more than a decision of the ICJ that gets shredded.
Can I just add to that by saying I agree with all of what you've both said, and that Australia seems to be ignoring the fact that we now operate in a multipolar world, and there are nations out there who are far more prepared to respect the sovereignty of other nations, to behave and interact in a collaborative way that ensures that everyone's interests are cared for and respected. And really, where we've continued to align ourselves with an outlier nation. which has led us into all these, military adventures and disastrous wars that have displaced millions of people around the world with very little regard for that impact on people's lives. My family were refugees that came from the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So, I have a natural affinity and, being in tune with that. But we are really not recognising, the mainstream media doesn't recognise, and I think our political class doesn't recognise the impact of our foreign policy decisions and alignment. And I think that there is great appetite amongst the Australian public and a desire for Australia to take a principled stand on things, not to have double standards applying, and to behave as a more responsible global citizen.
Yes, I think we have to wind it up there, but I might just conclude by saying a phrase might be the problem: Anglo-Saxon attitudes.